They burned the flag of her old unit, a scorched memory in a steel drum. Now, assigned to this forgotten outpost under a new, sterile designation, Anya Voronova was meant to be a ghost, her past erased by bureaucratic fire. But when the perimeter alarms screamed and the command systems failed, the ashes of that past began to stir, and she knew the time for ghosts was over. Soon, they would see the banner she truly served under, one not made of cloth, but of skill, silence, and survival. She moved through the dust-choked grounds of forward operating base Sentinel, a place that clung to the side of a jagged mountain range like a desperate prayer. Her transfer orders had been a study in deliberate obscurity. Specialist Voronova Anya. Logistics and inventory management. It was a joke, a punishment couched in the language of reassignment. They had taken her name, her rank, and her history, and given her a clipboard. The soldiers she passed saw a woman of indeterminate age, her face a mask of placid neutrality carved from years of discipline. Her movements were economical, fluid, betraying none of the coiled readiness that lived in her muscles. They saw a supply clerk. She saw vulnerabilities. She saw a primary generator with an exposed fuel line, a perimeter fence with a blind spot near the western ridge, and a communications array positioned on a crest that was a perfect target for long-range artillery. Her mind cataloged these things without conscious effort, the same way a farmer notes the signs of coming rain. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of rock dust and diesel fumes. Young soldiers, their faces still soft with the memory of home, hurried past, their boots crunching on the gravel path. They carried rifles with an unearned familiarity, their confidence a brittle shield against the vast, hostile emptiness that surrounded the base. One of them, a corporal named Ben Carter with earnest eyes and a perpetually worried brow, offered her a hesitant nod. "Ma'am," he said, the honorific a guess. She returned the nod, her expression unchanging. He saw politeness. She saw the fraying on his webbing and the way he favored his left leg, a subtle limp that suggested a poorly healed training injury. Another potential weakness in a crisis. Her new world was a small one, confined to a cavernous, corrugated metal warehouse that smelled of canvas and machine oil. She spent her days counting crates of rations, spare parts, and ammunition, her pen scratching against the manifest sheets. The work was mind-numbing, a deliberate purgatory. It was meant to break her, to grind the elite operative down into a compliant cog. But Anya did not break. She learned the rhythm of the base from its logistical heartbeat. She knew which squads expended ammunition fastest, which vehicles broke down most often, and how much morphine was used by the medics each week. The data painted a picture of the base's readiness, its fears, and its blind spots. It was a different kind of intelligence gathering, but intelligence nonetheless. The first real test of her anonymity came in the form of Colonel Marcus Thorne, the base commander. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains, his posture ramrod straight, his eyes the color of faded fatigues. He appeared at the warehouse entrance one afternoon, his shadow falling long and dark across the concrete floor. He held her personnel file, a folder so thin it seemed to contain only air. "Specialist Voronova," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority that expected and always received immediate deference. She simply looked up from her clipboard, her gaze steady. Colonel Thorne tapped the folder against his palm. "Your file is a blank page. Says you completed basic training and then nothing. 15 years of service, and the record shows nothing but a transfer from a clerical pool at Central Command. You understand how that looks?" "I understand that is what the file says, sir," Anya replied, her tone perfectly level. There was no defiance, no explanation, just a statement of fact. "This is a forward operating base, specialist, not a retirement home for paper pushers. Every person here has a function, a critical role. I don't have room for mysteries, so I'll ask you directly, what is your purpose here?" He was probing, looking for a reaction, a flicker of indignation or fear. He found nothing. Anya's control was absolute, a fortress built over years of enduring far worse than a skeptical commander. "My purpose is to manage logistics and inventory, Colonel. As per my orders, her answer was a brick wall. Thorne's jaw tightened. He saw insubordination in her stillness, a refusal to play the game of military hierarchy. He couldn't know that her stillness was her greatest weapon, that in the quiet, she was listening, observing, analyzing him just as she had analyzed the base's defenses. He saw a clerk. She saw a commander who relied too heavily on established protocols, a man whose confidence in the system made him vulnerable to anything that operated outside of it. "See that you do," he said, his voice clipped with disapproval. "I'll be watching you, specialist. Any deviation, any hint of trouble, and you'll be on the next transport back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Is that clear?" "Crystal, sir," she said, her eyes already returning to the manifest in her hands. He was dismissed. The colonel, accustomed to being the one who ended conversations, stood there for a moment, nonplussed. Then he turned on his heel and strode out, leaving Anya to the silence and the endless rows of crates. The encounter left ripples in the small pond of the base. Whispers followed her. The ghost from Central Command. The clerk with the empty file. She became a curiosity, a blank space the soldiers tried to fill with speculation. She ignored it all, focusing on her work, on her observations. The quiet tension was a familiar companion. It was the silence before the storm, and Anya knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the storm was coming. Her dismissal by Colonel Thorne was not a singular event but the opening salvo in a quiet war of attrition. He made his presence felt through proxies. The warehouse inspections became more frequent, led by a humorless master sergeant who would run a white glove over shelves she had dusted an hour before. Her supply requests were scrutinized, delayed, and sometimes denied for reasons that were patently absurd. They were testing her, trying to provoke a response, to find a crack in the placid facade. Anya gave them nothing. She met every bureaucratic obstacle with meticulous paperwork and unwavering patience. Her ledgers were flawless. Her inventory counts were perfect to the last bullet. She was the model of an unremarkable but efficient clerk, a performance so complete it only deepened Thorne's suspicion. He couldn't reconcile the woman in front of him with the gaping void in her service record. Men and women with 15 years in the service had histories, commendations, disciplinary actions, a trail of existence. Anya had nothing. It was as if she had been born into the military a month ago. The other soldiers, taking their cue from the command staff, kept their distance. They treated her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. In the mess hall, she ate alone, her table an island in a sea of boisterous camaraderie. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Her isolation was a tool. It allowed her to observe them unnoticed. She learned their names, their habits, the dynamics of their squads. She saw the bravado of young leaders and the weariness of seasoned non-commissioned officers. She saw who was sharp, who was sloppy, who could be counted on when things went wrong. Private Lena Petrova, a young signals intelligence operator, was one of the few who watched Anya with something other than suspicion. Petrova was quiet herself, a small, bird-like woman who seemed to fade into the background. From her console in the dimly lit Tactical Operations Center, TOC, she had a different view of the base. She dealt in patterns, in the invisible rivers of data that flowed in and out of FOB Sentinel. And she had noticed something odd about the new logistics specialist. Voronova's requisitions, while seemingly random, had a strange prescience. She ordered extra plasma 3 days before a patrol hit an improvised explosive device. She requested a specific set of high-torque wrenches a week before the primary generator's coolant pump failed. Each time it was dismissed as coincidence, but the pattern was there. It was as if the clerk could see the future. Petrova never spoke of it. She just watched, her curiosity a silent, growing flame. Anya was aware of the young private's scrutiny. She recognized the analyst's mindset, the search for meaning in chaos. She offered no encouragement, no acknowledgement. Let the girl watch. Observation was a skill to be respected. One evening, as Anya was locking the supply warehouse, Corporal Carter approached her again, his usual earnestness tempered with a nervous energy. He was holding a standard-issue rifle, and he handled it with the awkwardness of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Ma'am? Specialist Voronova?" he began, stumbling over the name. Anya turned, her keys jingling softly in her hand. "Corporal, I have a question. It's about my rifle. The firing pin. It feels sluggish. The armorer said it's within spec, but it doesn't feel right. I thought, since you handle all the spare parts." He trailed off, suddenly aware of how strange his request must sound. Asking the supply clerk for mechanical advice. Anya didn't mock him. She simply held out her hand. "Let me see." Carter eagerly passed the weapon over. Anya took it with a practiced ease that seemed utterly at odds with her role. Her hands moved over the rifle with an intimate knowledge. It was not the touch of a clerk. It was the touch of a master craftsman. Her fingers found the seams, testing the fit of the components. Without looking, she broke it down, her movements a blur of efficiency. The rifle was disassembled on a nearby crate in seconds. Carter watched, his mouth slightly agape. He had spent weeks learning that process, and he still fumbled with the retaining pins. Anya ignored his awe. She picked up the bolt carrier group, tilting it under the weak glow of the security light. She ran a thumb over the firing pin. "The armorer is correct," she said, her voice calm and even. "It is within standard specifications." Carter's face fell. "Oh, okay. Sorry to bother you, but..." Anya continued, holding up the pin. "Standard specs are for standard conditions. They don't account for the fine-grained dust here. It's corrosive. It mixes with the lubricant to create a paste. It slows the action by a few milliseconds. You won't notice it on the firing range. But in a sustained firefight, that hesitation will cause a stovepipe jam." She looked directly at him. "And you will die." The words were delivered without emotion, a simple statement of cause and effect. They hit Carter with the force of a physical blow. Anya then produced a small, unmarked vial from her pocket and a soft, lint-free cloth. She meticulously cleaned the pin and the channel it sat in, applying a single drop of a graphite-based lubricant. "This won't gum up," she explained. "Reclean it every 48 hours." She reassembled the rifle with the same blinding speed, the final click of the components seating together sounding sharp and final in the quiet evening. She handed it back to him. The action was smooth, crisp, perfect. "Thank you, ma'am," Carter whispered, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "How did you know that?" Anya simply picked up her keys. "I count inventory," she said, and walked away into the growing darkness, leaving the young corporal to stare at his weapon as if he were seeing it for the first time. The interaction was a small stone dropped into the water, but the ripples were spreading. The quiet clerk in the warehouse knew things she shouldn't know. And for the first time, some of the soldiers began to wonder if Colonel Thorne's mystery was not a liability, but something else entirely. Anya's days settled into a predictable rhythm, a quiet metronome of counting and cataloging. She used the monotony as a form of meditation, a way to sharpen her focus and push the ghosts of her past into the deep recesses of her mind. The burning flag, the faces of her fallen comrades, the political betrayal that had led her here. They were always there, just beneath the surface. The discipline of her mundane work kept them at bay. She continued her silent study of FOB Sentinel, her mind a relentless cartographer of its strengths and weaknesses. The base was a living organism, and she was learning its anatomy. She knew the patrol schedules, the shift changes of the guards in the towers, the dead zones in the radio coverage. She could predict, with unnerving accuracy, when the mess hall would serve powdered eggs and when the precious fresh fruit would arrive on the weekly supply convoy. Her observations were not idle. They were part of a deeply ingrained protocol, a survival instinct honed over years of operating in places where the smallest detail could mean the difference between life and death. She mapped escape routes in her head, identified potential fallback positions, and calculated fields of fire from every structure. She did this unconsciously, the same way other people breathe. She was a weapon, and even at rest, a weapon is still a weapon. She noticed the subtle increase in enemy chatter, a low hum of activity just beyond the horizon that the official intelligence reports had not yet flagged. The signals analysts, including Private Petrova, were good at their jobs, but they were looking for known patterns, for established enemy signatures. Anya was listening for the silence between the words, for the things that were not being said. It was a change in the atmospheric pressure of the conflict, a subtle shift that foretold a coming storm. Colonel Thorne remained a distant, watchful presence. He no longer visited the warehouse, but Anya felt his eyes on her. She would see him observing her from the window of the TOC, his expression unreadable. Her flawless performance as a clerk had not allayed his suspicions. It had crystallized them. In his world of rigid order, perfection was an anomaly, and anomalies were threats. He had requested her full, unredacted file from Central Command. The request had been denied, returned with a curt, high-level directive. Specialist Voronova is to be allowed to perform her assigned duties. Do not inquire further. This only fueled his frustration. He was a commander responsible for the lives of hundreds of soldiers, and he had a ghost in his supply depot, a woman protected by an authority he could not challenge. The younger soldiers, however, were beginning to see her differently. Carter, emboldened by her help with his rifle, spread the story. He told his squad mates how she had diagnosed the problem with a single touch, how her hands had moved with an impossible speed and precision. The story was embellished with each telling, taking on the quality of a legend. The clerk became a mythical armorer, a secret master of weapons. Others came to her with quiet, hesitant requests. A private whose night vision goggles were malfunctioning. A sergeant with a jammed sidearm. Anya helped them all. Her advice always brief, precise, and devastatingly effective. She never explained how she knew these things. Her standard reply was always a variation of, "It is my job to know the equipment." This explanation was both true and a complete misdirection. She wasn't just a clerk who knew the inventory. She was an operator who had used, maintained, and field repaired every piece of equipment on the base under the most extreme conditions imaginable. She was a living encyclopedia of military hardware, but she allowed them to believe she was simply a diligent student of the supply manuals. One afternoon, while she was conducting a routine inventory of medical supplies, she noticed a discrepancy. The manifest listed 50 units of a specific blood-clotting agent, but she could only account for 48. It was a small difference, easily dismissed as a clerical error. But Anya didn't believe in clerical errors. She cross-referenced the medical logs. There was no record of the 2 missing units being used. She checked the outgoing supply requests. Nothing. The 2 units had simply vanished. She didn't report it. Reporting it would draw attention, create questions she had no intention of answering. Instead, she filed it away, another piece of the intricate puzzle of the base. It was a loose thread, and Anya knew that loose threads, if pulled, could unravel everything. She sat in the quiet of the medical supply locker, the air cool and smelling of antiseptic. She looked at the rows of neatly stacked boxes, at the life-saving equipment that was her current charge. In her old life, she had been the one on the other side of the supply chain, the end user. She had carried kits like these into the dark, her body a canvas of carefully prepared tools for survival and lethality. She remembered packing a wound on a fallen comrade under a hail of gunfire, her fingers slick with blood, the clotting agent a precious, life-giving dust. The memory was sharp, visceral. It brought with it the familiar ache of loss, the weight of a past they had tried to bury. They could burn her flag, they could erase her name from the records, but they could not erase the memories etched into her very soul. They could not take away the skills that lived in her hands, in her eyes, in the cold, calculating part of her brain that was always on, always watching, always ready. The base was a tinderbox, surrounded by an unseen enemy, commanded by a suspicious officer, and populated by young soldiers whose lives depended on protocols that Anya knew were inadequate. She finished her count, made a note of the missing clotting agent, and locked the cabinet. The metronome of her quiet life continued its steady beat, but she could feel the rhythm beginning to falter. The pressure was building. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. The storm broke not with a bang, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. It began in the Tactical Operations Center, the nerve center of FOB Sentinel. One moment, The room was a low hum of activity, the chatter of radios, the clicking of keyboards, the murmur of voices tracking friendly patrols. The next, it was dead. The screens went black. The radios hissed static. The satellite uplinks failed. Every stream of data, every line of communication to the outside world, was severed. A collective gasp went through the room. Private Petrova stared at her console, her face pale in the eerie glow of the emergency backup lights. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing commands, running diagnostics. Nothing. It wasn't a power failure. The local systems were still running. It was as if the base had been wrapped in a shroud, cutting it off from the universe. Colonel Thorne stormed into the TOC, his face a thundercloud. "Report!" he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Everything is down, sir," Petrova said, her voice trembling slightly. "All comms, all satellite links. It's not equipment failure. It feels targeted. It's like the entire spectrum has been wiped clean." "Jamming?" Thorne growled, stating the obvious. "Hostile electronic warfare. Get it back up." Now the comms technicians, a team of specialists who were experts in their field, descended into a frantic, controlled chaos. They followed their training, running through checklists, rebooting systems, rerouting power. But every attempt failed. The static remained, a solid wall of white noise. They were blind, deaf, and alone. The panic in the TOC began to spread throughout the base. Soldiers looked up at the silent radio antennas, a sense of profound isolation creeping into their hearts. They were a tiny island in a vast, hostile ocean, and their lifeline had just been cut. The pressure mounted with every passing minute. Patrol was overdue. Were they in trouble? Were they trying to call for help? There was no way to know. Thorne's face was grim. His command was predicated on information, on communication. Without it, he was just a man in a box, guessing at the shadows outside. In the supply warehouse, Anya felt the shift immediately. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of sound. The background hum of the base's electronic life had vanished. She put down her clipboard and walked to the door, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked up at the sky, her eyes scanning the horizon. She saw nothing, but she felt everything. This was not a simple jammer. This was sophisticated, powerful, and precise. It was a professional's work. She watched as runners were dispatched from the TOC, carrying messages on foot like soldiers from a bygone era. She saw the confusion and fear on their faces. The modern army was a creature of technology. Stripped of it, it was clumsy and vulnerable. Corporal Carter found her there, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Specialist, did you hear? All the comms are down. They think it's the enemy." "The colonel is losing his mind." Anya said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on the main communications array on the ridge. It was a collection of dishes and antennas, the base's ear to the world. And now it was useless. Her mind was already working the problem. She wasn't thinking about the what. She was thinking about the how. How was the jamming signal being generated? How was it being delivered? It was too clean, too total for a ground-based unit. A ground jammer would have a detectable footprint, a direction. This was a blanket. It suggested something airborne or something far more advanced. A multi-point, frequency-agile system that was actively hunting and suppressing their attempts to broadcast. While the experts in the TOC were trying to punch through the wall of static, Anya knew that was the wrong approach. You don't punch a wall of water. You find a way to swim through it. She walked back into her warehouse, her purpose clear. The others were panicking. She was calm. The pressure that was crushing them was the environment she had been forged in. This was her world. She went to a locked cage at the back of the warehouse, a section marked for obsolete or decommissioned equipment. She unlocked it and began to search through the dusty crates. Carter followed her, bewildered. "What are you doing? Shouldn't we be, I don't know, taking cover?" Anya ignored him. Her hands moved with certainty, pushing aside old radios and forgotten electronics. She was looking for something specific, a piece of technology that hadn't been standard issue for a decade. She found it at the bottom of a heavy wooden crate, a PRC-117F radio, an old multiband tactical unit. It was heavy, bulky, and by modern standards, a dinosaur. But it had one unique feature that its newer, more sophisticated replacements lacked: a manual tuning knob and a direct, analog interface. Modern radios were software-defined. They were powerful but rigid, their functions locked behind layers of digital protocol. They were designed to be user-friendly, to prevent soldiers from accidentally broadcasting on incorrect frequencies. That design was now their prison. The old radio was a wild horse. It was difficult to control, but it could go where the thoroughbreds could not. She pulled it out, along with a spool of copper wire, a set of alligator clips, and a hand crank generator. "Help me with this," she said to Carter, her first direct order to him. He was too stunned to do anything but comply. He hefted the heavy radio while she gathered the other components. They were a strange sight. The stoic clerk and the wide-eyed corporal, carrying a piece of museum-quality equipment through a base on high alert. No one stopped them. No one even noticed them. All eyes were on the TOC, waiting for a miracle from the experts. Anya was not waiting for a miracle. She was building one from spare parts. Anya led Carter not to the TOC, but to a small, forgotten storage bunker built into the hillside at the northern edge of the base. It was a relic from a previous occupation, its concrete walls thick and its position offering a clear line of sight to the eastern mountain peaks but obscured from the main communications array. It was a dead zone for most internal communications, which was precisely why she chose it. The electronic warfare was a blanket, but every blanket has a frayed edge. She was looking for the fray. Inside the dusty bunker, she set the PRC-117F on a makeshift table. "Crank!" she ordered Carter, pointing to the generator. He began to turn the handle, and the radio hummed to life with a low, analog hiss. The others were trying to use brute force to blast a signal through the jamming. Anya was going to listen. She stripped the ends of the copper wire with her teeth and attached them to the radio's antenna port, creating a crude but effective long-wire antenna. She didn't string it up outside. That would be too obvious. Instead, she laid it out along the length of the bunker's floor, using the conductive properties of the rebar in the concrete to amplify the signal. It was an old trick, one not found in any modern manual. She put on a headset, her eyes closing as she tuned out the world and focused on the static. The main room of the TOC was a pressure cooker. Colonel Thorne paced back and forth like a caged tiger, his commands growing sharper and more frayed with every failed attempt. The technicians were sweating, their faces illuminated by the red glow of error messages on their screens. "Try a frequency hop," Thorne demanded. "We have, sir," a young lieutenant shot back, his professionalism cracking under the strain. "It's a responsive system. The moment we open a new channel, it clamps down. It's smarter than we are." Meanwhile, in the bunker, Anya was not trying to talk. She was listening. She turned the manual tuning knob with microscopic precision, her fingers sensitive to the slightest change in the texture of the static. The others were hearing a wall of noise. Anya was hearing a symphony. She could discern the different layers of the jamming signal, the powerful wideband blanket, and the subtler, agile hunter-killer frequencies that were actively suppressing their transmitters. She heard the ghost echoes of her own base's failed attempts to broadcast, brief shrieks of data that were snuffed out in milliseconds. She kept tuning, moving down the spectrum, into the low-frequency bands that were considered obsolete for modern data transmission. And there, buried deep beneath the roar of the primary jamming, she found it. A tiny, almost imperceptible pulse. It was a carrier wave, the heartbeat of the jamming system itself. It was the signal that synchronized all the different elements of the electronic attack. The enemy had made a mistake. In their effort to create an impenetrable wall of noise, they had to coordinate their own jammers. And that coordination signal, by its very nature, had to be consistent. It was the system's Achilles heel. She didn't try to transmit. Not yet. She just listened, her head tilted, a cartographer mapping the enemy's invisible weapon. She motioned for Carter to stop cranking. The radio went silent. "Get me a notepad and a pen," she said, her voice a low whisper. "And tell no one we are here." Carter, who had been watching in a state of mesmerized confusion, simply nodded and scurried out of the bunker. He returned moments later, his hands trembling as he handed her the supplies. Anya began to write, her pen flying across the page. She wasn't writing a message. She was writing mathematics. She was calculating the cycle time of the carrier wave, mapping its frequency shifts, analyzing the data packets it contained. In minutes, she had a complete schematic of the enemy's EW system. It was a distributed network, likely a series of drones, all slaved to a central command signal. The system was powerful, but it had a flaw. It created micro-windows, tiny gaps in its coverage that lasted for mere nanoseconds as the frequencies shifted. They were too small for a voice or data transmission to pass through. But they weren't too small for a single, compressed data burst. A digital needle, aimed at a fleeting hole in the fabric of the storm. She looked at the old radio. It was too slow, its technology too primitive to exploit such a small window. But it had given her the key. She now knew the exact timing, the precise frequency, and the nature of the lock. She stood up. "Stay here. Guard this equipment," she told Carter. "Don't let anyone touch it." She walked out of the bunker and strode purposefully towards the TOC, the notepad clutched in her hand. The guards at the door, accustomed to seeing her as the quiet clerk, moved to block her way. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area." Anya didn't break stride. She looked past them, her voice carrying a weight of command that was utterly new. "Get the colonel." Her tone was not a request. It was an order. The guards hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden transformation. Before they could react, Colonel Thorne appeared at the doorway, his face a mask of fury and frustration. "What is this? Specialist, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Anya held up the notepad. "I can get a message out, Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the noise and panic of the TOC. "But you have to listen to me, and you have to do exactly what I say." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the logistics clerk who was standing at the entrance to the command center, holding a piece of paper and challenging the authority of the base commander in the middle of a crisis. It was an act of supreme insubordination or supreme confidence. Thorne stared at her, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was the paper pusher, the ghost, and she was claiming she could do what his entire team of highly trained specialists could not. His first instinct was to have her arrested. But then he saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a clerk. They were the eyes of a predator, calm, focused, and absolutely certain. In that moment, he saw a hint of the woman who had been erased from the files. And against his better judgment, he made a decision that would change everything. "Let her in," he said. The atmosphere inside the TOC shifted from panicked chaos to stunned silence as Anya walked to the central communications console. The technicians and officers parted before her, their faces a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Colonel Thorne stood behind her, his arms crossed, his expression a storm of skepticism and intrigue. "This is my senior comms officer, Lieutenant Jacobs," Thorne said, his voice tight. "Explain your theory to him." Anya ignored the lieutenant. She placed the notepad on the console and spoke directly to Private Petrova, the quiet analyst she had observed weeks earlier. "Petrova, you're the sharpest one here. Your fingers are faster. I need you at this keyboard." Petrova looked at Thorne, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The colonel gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The private slid into the chair, her hands hovering over the keys. Anya's presence had changed the room's entire dynamic. She wasn't frantic or loud. Her calm was more commanding than Thorne's shouting had ever been. "The enemy is using a synchronized, frequency-agile jamming net," Anya began, her voice crisp and clear, a lecturer in a classroom of war. "You've been trying to punch through it. That's like trying to punch through a waterfall. The system is designed to absorb and counter that kind of brute force. But it has a flaw." She tapped the equations on her notepad. "The jammers are coordinated by a master carrier wave. That wave has a predictable, repeating cycle. Within that cycle, as the system recalibrates between frequency hops, there are gaps. Nanoseconds long. Too short for voice, but long enough for a compressed data packet," Lieutenant Jacobs scoffed. "That's theoretical. Even if those windows exist, We don't have the equipment to time a transmission that precisely. We do, Anya said, not even glancing at him. Our system is trying to do it automatically, but it's too slow. We're going to do it manually. She turned to Petrova. I need you to write a simple compression algorithm. Take a 12-word message, encode it into a single burst, and queue it for transmission. Can you do that? Petrova stared at her, then at the complex mathematics on the notepad. Anya had not only identified the problem, but had also reverse-engineered the enemy's signal architecture. It was a feat of signals intelligence that should have taken a team of experts days, if not weeks. Petrova swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, I can do that. Good, Anya said. Colonel, your message. 12 words. No more. Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second, then leaned in. FOB Sentinel under electronic attack. Request immediate aerial reconnaissance. Probable hostile drone swarm. It was 11 words. Precise. Professional. Anya nodded. Petrova, encode it, as the private's fingers began to fly across the keyboard, crafting the tiny digital needle they would throw into the storm. Anya turned to Lieutenant Jacobs. I need you to decouple the transmitter's automatic frequency control. I need direct, manual access to the broadcast timer. That's against every protocol. Jacobs protested. It could damage the equipment. The equipment is currently a very expensive paperweight, Anya countered, her voice dropping to an icy calm. Either we do it my way, or we can all sit here in the dark until the enemy decides to walk through the front gate. Your choice? Lieutenant Thorne's eyes bored into Jacobs. Do it reluctantly. The lieutenant began typing commands, bypassing safety lockouts and stripping away the layers of automation that were designed to protect the system from human error. He was handing the keys to a multi-million-dollar communications array to a supply clerk. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. A digital countdown timer appeared on the main screen, calibrated to milliseconds. Packet is encoded and queued, Petrova announced, her voice steady. Transmitter is unlocked, Jacob said, stepping back from the console as if it were radioactive. Anya now stood alone before the screen. She held a single, disconnected computer mouse in her hand, its cable dangling uselessly. It wasn't connected to anything. It was just a switch, a trigger. She looked at the screen, not at the numbers, but through them. She was no longer in the TOC. She was back in the bunker, listening to the rhythm of the enemy's system, the pulse of the carrier wave she had found. It was a song she had memorized. The entire room held its breath. The fate of the base, and everyone in it, rested on the timing of a single click from a woman with no official qualifications, no authority, and no past. Her eyes were unfocused, her body perfectly still. She was listening to an invisible beat. She was waiting for the precise moment, the nanosecond-long gap in a wall of impenetrable energy. The tension stretched, becoming a physical thing in the air. Thorne found he was not breathing. He had gambled his command, his career, on the inexplicable confidence of this ghost. Seconds felt like hours. Then her thumb moved. Click. The sound was tiny, almost insignificant in the silent room. On the screen, a single green line flashed. Packet sent. It was followed immediately by a dozen red error messages as the enemy's jamming system clamped back down. But it was too late. The needle had found the hole. The message was gone. For a long moment, nothing happened. The static on the radios continued its relentless hiss. Lieutenant Jacobs let out a sigh, a sound of bitter confirmation. It didn't work. I told you. He was cut off by a sudden, ear-splitting screech from one of the speakers. It was not static. It was the sound of a secure digital handshake. Petrova's hands flew to her keyboard. I'm getting a response, she yelled, her voice breaking with emotion. It's from command. They received our message. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost dizzying washed through the TOC. Men and women who had been rigid with fear sagged against their consoles. Someone let out a choked cheer. Thorne stared at Anya, his face a canvas of stunned disbelief. The ghost in his supply depot had just done the impossible. She had single-handedly broken through a sophisticated electronic siege using obsolete equipment, unorthodox methods, and an almost supernatural understanding of the invisible battlefield. She had saved them. Anya showed no reaction. She placed the mouse back on the console, her work done. She turned and walked towards the exit, her job complete. Specialist! Thorne's voice boomed, stopping her at the door. Where are you going? Anya looked back at him, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. My shift is over, Colonel, she said. I have to lock up the warehouse, and then she was gone, leaving behind a room full of soldiers who were looking at her empty space with a newfound sense of awe and 1,000 unanswered questions. The whispers that had followed her before would now be replaced by a legend. The shift had begun. The aftermath of the communications breakthrough was transformative. News of what had happened in the TOC spread through FOB Sentinel like wildfire. The story, already dramatic, was amplified with each retelling. The quiet logistics specialist was no longer a ghost. She was an enigma, a figure of burgeoning myth. Soldiers would fall silent when she entered the mess hall, their conversations picking up again in hushed tones only after she had passed. They watched her with a mixture of reverence and fear. They had witnessed a glimpse of something they didn't understand, a level of competence that was so far beyond their own experience it felt like magic. Corporal Carter became a minor celebrity by association. He was cornered in the barracks, in the chow line, by soldiers desperate for any detail about the mysterious specialist Voronova. What did she say in the bunker? How did she know what to do? Carter, to his credit, didn't invent stories. He just described what he had seen. Her absolute calm, the impossible speed of her hands, the way she seemed to listen to silence. His simple, honest account was more powerful than any fabrication. She didn't look like she was guessing, he told his squad mates, his voice low with awe. She looked like she was remembering. In the command center, the mood was one of deep introspection. Lieutenant Jacobs and his team of technicians pored over the data logs, trying to comprehend what Anya had done. They analyzed the equations she had scribbled on the notepad. It was a masterful piece of reverse engineering, a level of signals intelligence analysis that was beyond any of them. They had been trained to operate the machinery. She had understood the soul of the machine. Colonel Thorne was a man wrestling with a profound cognitive dissonance. Everything he knew about military order and protocol had been turned on its head. He had built his career on structure, on rules, on the clear lines of authority. Anya Voronova defied all of it. She was a subordinate who had taken command, a clerk who had outthought his entire expert staff, a ghost who had saved his base. He reread her thin, useless file a dozen times. Told him nothing. He sent another, more urgent request to Central Command, this time using the secure channel Anya had opened. His message was simple. Who is Specialist Anya Voronova? The response that came back hours later was even more chilling than the previous denials. It was a single, encrypted line from a 4-star general's office. For your security and hers, stop asking. The warning was clear. He was not just dealing with a soldier with a redacted past. He was dealing with someone so important or so dangerous that even a full colonel in a combat zone was forbidden from knowing her identity. His suspicion of her didn't vanish. It evolved. It was no longer the suspicion of a commander towards a potential problem, but the wary respect one predator gives another. He began to watch her not for signs of trouble, but for signs of her true nature. He saw it in the way she walked, a perfect economy of motion. He saw it in the way she observed a passing convoy, her eyes tracking not the vehicles, but the spaces between them, the potential ambush points. He was a professional soldier, and he was finally recognizing another, one whose profession was far deadlier than his own. Anya, for her part, seemed utterly unaffected by the change in her status. She returned to her warehouse, to her clipboards and her inventory counts. She answered the tentative greetings from other soldiers with the same neutral nod. She ate her meals alone. To the outside observer, nothing had changed. But inside, the fortress of her control was being tested. The brief, intense burst of action in the TOC had awakened the part of her they had tried to bury. The instincts, the cold analytical rage, the familiar adrenaline of a life-or-death problem. It was all there, humming just beneath the surface. It was like a language she had been forbidden to speak, and she had just shouted a perfect, eloquent sentence. It was a dangerous feeling. That part of her had cost her everything. Her unit, her name, her flag. Letting it out, even for a moment, was a risk. But it had also felt right. It had felt like coming home. One afternoon, a few days after the incident, Private Petrova found the courage to approach her. She found Anya in the warehouse, meticulously organizing medical supplies. "Specialist Voronova?" Petrova began, her voice barely a whisper. Anya looked up, her hands still. "The algorithm you had me write," Petrova continued, "the compression logic. It was based on a deprecated special operations signal protocol. Codenamed Ghostvine, it was decommissioned years ago. It's not in any of the current manuals." Anya's expression did not change, but her eyes were fixed on the young private. "I read a case study on it at the Intelligence Academy. It was used by a deep reconnaissance unit. They were disavowed. The records are sealed." Anya slowly placed a box of bandages on a shelf, her movement precise. She turned to face Petrova fully. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was a confirmation, a warning, and a question all at once. Petrova understood. She was treading on sacred, dangerous ground. "Your secret is safe with me," the private whispered. I wanted to say thank you." Anya gave a single, slow nod. It was more acknowledgement than Petrova had ever seen her give anyone. The young analyst turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She had looked behind the curtain and had seen a glimpse of the truth. The quiet clerk was a legend from a ghost story, a soldier from a unit that no longer officially existed, and the respect she felt was now mingled with a profound and chilling sense of awe. The drone swarm arrived 2 days later. Anya's message had been a warning, but the enemy's timeline was faster than command's response. The attack began at dusk, the worst possible time. The fading light created long, deceptive shadows, and the cooling air distorted thermal imaging. The first sign was a high-pitched whine, a sound like a million angry insects that grew rapidly in volume. On the radar screens in the newly functional TOC, a massive cloud appeared over the western ridge, moving fast. "Multiple hostiles inbound," an operator shouted. "Too many to count. They're small, fast-moving." Drone's Colonel Thorne was in command, but this time his eyes kept flicking to the door, as if expecting Anya to appear and solve the problem for him. But she was not in the TOC. She was in her warehouse, her shift having ended an hour before. The base's automated defenses roared to life. Phalanx cannons, computer-controlled Gatling guns, began to spin, tracking and firing at the incoming swarm. The air filled with the sound of their deep, percussive thumps and the brighter crackle of exploding drones. But for every one they shot down, 10 more seemed to take its place. They were small, agile, and armed with explosive charges. They weren't targeting the heavily armored structures. They were targeting people. The first explosions rocked the open areas of the base, walkways, guard posts, the motor pool. Shouts and screams echoed over the roar of the cannons. The base's defense was a blunt instrument designed to stop missiles and aircraft. It was ill-suited for this kind of saturation attack. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Thorne gripped the edge of the central command table, his knuckles white. "Get all personnel under cover. I want every soldier with a rifle on the perimeter walls. Set up overlapping fields of fire." His orders were sound, by the book. But the book hadn't been written for this. The soldiers on the walls were exposed, easy targets for the swarming drones that could attack from any angle. A new, more sinister threat emerged. Mixed in with the explosive drones were smaller, faster ones. These weren't attacking. They were painting targets with laser designators. Moments later, mortar rounds began to rain down on the base, striking with pinpoint accuracy at the newly illuminated positions. The enemy was coordinating a complex, multi-layered assault. The drone swarm was a screen, a distraction to sow chaos while the mortars did the real killing. The base was in a state of reactive defense, always a step behind the enemy's plan. Casualties were mounting. The medics were overwhelmed. In the middle of the chaos, Thorn made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He grabbed a radio. Find Specialist Voronova. Get her to the TOC. Now, but Anya was already moving. When the first alarm had sounded, she had not sought cover. She had climbed to the roof of her warehouse, a position that gave her a commanding view of the entire base and the western ridge beyond. She lay flat against the corrugated metal, perfectly still, a pair of standard-issue binoculars pressed to her eyes. She wasn't watching the swarm. She was watching the space above the swarm. The chaos below was just noise. The real threat was the source of the commands. The drones were not autonomous. They were being controlled. The mortars were not firing randomly. They were being directed. She scanned the darkening sky, her eyes tracing the invisible lines of command and control. Thorn's order to bring her to the TOC was relayed across the base. Corporal Carter, taking cover behind a concrete barrier, heard it over his squad radio. He knew he couldn't get to the warehouse. It was across an open area being strafed by the drones. But he knew where she might be. He remembered the bunker. He sprinted, low and fast, dodging explosions, his heart pounding with a desperate hope that she would be there, that she would have another miracle for them. When he reached the bunker, it was empty. The old radio sat on the table, cold and silent. Carter's shoulders slumped in defeat. Then he heard a voice, sharp and clear, over the radio he still carried. It was Thorn. Voronova, do you read me? What is your status? A moment of static, and then her voice answered, as calm as if she were reading a grocery list. Colonel, I am in position. I have eyes on the control element. There was a collective pause across the entire command net. She was somewhere outside, in the middle of the battle, and she was talking about the enemy's command. Where are you? Thorn demanded. And what do you see? Negative on my location, Colonel. It's better you don't know, she replied, her voice unwavering despite a nearby explosion. The drone control is coming from a high-altitude platform. It's stationary, masked by the swarm. But the mortar fire, that's different. The laser designators are short-range. That means the spotter team is close. Very close on the roof. Anya lowered her binoculars. She had seen it, a faint, almost invisible shimmer in the air high above the main swarm. A stealth drone, the shepherd for the flock of wolves below. But taking that out wouldn't stop the mortars. The mortars were the immediate threat. She scanned the rocky terrain just outside the perimeter fence, the area of dead ground she had identified weeks ago. The spotter team would be there. They had to be. Thorn was now faced with a terrible choice. He had a credible, unseen intelligence source outside the wire, but he couldn't verify it. His entire command structure was telling him to focus on the swarm, to protect his soldiers inside the base. But Anya was telling him the real fight was elsewhere. Specialist, what do you need? Thorn asked, his voice tight. It was an admission of trust, a blank check offered in the middle of a battle. Anya's reply was immediate and precise. I need a sniper team, your best two. Have them meet me at the northern perimeter, Sector 4. They will bring their rifles and one other thing, a thermobaric grenade. And Colonel, I need you to create a diversion, a big one, something that will draw the swarm's attention to the southern side of the base for exactly 90 seconds. This was her second test. It wasn't a puzzle in a quiet room anymore. It was a life-and-death gamble, a request for men and material for a plan he couldn't see, based on the word of a woman he didn't know. He looked at the casualty reports flooding his screen. He looked at the panicked faces of his staff. His way was failing. He had to trust the ghost. Do it, he commanded into the radio. All units, concentrate fire on the southern perimeter. Light it up. You have 90 seconds. Sniper team, you have your orders. Move. The base erupted in a new fury of concentrated fire, a desperate, brilliant gamble to buy a few moments for a plan that only one person truly understood. As the bulk of the base's defensive fire shifted to the southern perimeter, drawing the attention of the drone swarm like moths to a flame, Anya slipped off the warehouse roof. She moved through the shadows, a wraith in the chaos. The explosions and gunfire provided perfect cover for her movements. She reached the rendezvous point in Sector 4, a section of the perimeter fence near a rocky outcropping, just as two soldiers arrived. They were the base's top sniper team. Sergeant Omar Hassan, the shooter, and Corporal Eva Rostova, his spotter. They were professionals, their movements economical, their eyes constantly scanning. They saw Anya emerge from the darkness and hesitated, their expressions a mixture of confusion and professional skepticism. "We were told to meet a specialist Voronova," Hassan said, his voice a low baritone. "I'm Voronova," she replied, her voice cutting through the din of battle. "Your 90 seconds started 10 seconds ago. Follow me." She didn't wait for a response. She produced a pair of wire cutters and snipped a hole in the perimeter fence, a cardinal sin in any normal circumstance. She slipped through it and into the darkness outside the wire. After a shared glance of disbelief, the two snipers followed her. They were moving into the kill zone, willingly leaving the relative safety of the base on the orders of a logistics clerk. Anya led them on a path that was not direct, but winding. She used the terrain for cover, moving from rock to rock, her silhouette never breaking the line of the ridge. She moved with a speed and silence that left the highly trained snipers struggling to keep up. She was not just moving through the landscape, she was part of it. "Spotter team will be on that ridge," she whispered, pointing to a dark shape 200 meters away. "They'll have a commanding view of the base and good cover. They feel safe there." "How can you be sure?" Rostova asked, her voice hushed. "Because that's where I would be," Anya said simply. The statement hung in the air, its implications vast. They crawled the last 50 meters on their bellies, the sharp rocks digging into their skin. Anya led them to a position that was slightly below the crest of a small hill, giving them a clear line of sight to the enemy ridge while keeping them concealed. "Rostova, use your thermal," Anya commanded in a whisper. "Scan the far ridge. Look for 2 heat signatures close together. They'll be static, well hidden." The young corporal deployed the advanced thermal scope, its screen glowing with an eerie, monochromatic light. She scanned the rocks, her movements slow and methodical. The diversionary fire from the base was beginning to die down. Their window was closing. "Nothing," Rostova whispered, frustration in her voice. "The rocks are still warm from the day. It's blurring the signatures. They're using thermal blankets to mask their heat," Anya said. It wasn't a question. "Give it to me." Rostova hesitated, reluctant to hand over her expensive, calibrated equipment. Hassan gave her a sharp nod. Anya took the scope. Her hands were steady, her movements sure. She didn't scan randomly. She looked at the rock formations, analyzing them for tactical advantages. She was looking for the one perfect spot a professional sniper team would choose. Then she stopped. "There," she breathed. She pointed the scope at a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders. "Look at the air in that gap. See the distortion? This heat shimmer. Their body heat is warming the air as it flows out of the crevice. It's faint, but it's there." Rostova looked. She was trained to look for bodies, for shapes. Anya was looking at the air itself, and she was right. A faint, almost invisible wave of heat was rising from the crevice. "Hassan," Anya said, her voice now pure command. "The shot is yours. 210 meters. Wind is negligible, but you have 1 shot. If you miss, they'll know we're here, and they'll call in a mortar strike on this position before you can chamber another round." Sergeant Hassan was already in position, his 338 Lapua Magnum rifle a steady extension of his body. He was a master of his craft, one of the best snipers in the entire theater of operations. But he was taking orders from a woman he had never met, based on an observation he couldn't have made himself. He looked through his scope, adjusting for the range. He couldn't see a target, only rock. "I have no visual," he said, his voice tight with professional pride. "You will," Anya promised. She took the thermobaric grenade from Rostova's pack. It was a specialized weapon, creating a massive pressure wave and a brilliant flash, designed for clearing bunkers. "When I give the word, Rostova, you will use your laser rangefinder to paint the rock face just to the right of the crevice. The flash from the grenade will be bright, but the laser from your rangefinder will be brighter to their night vision. For a fraction of a second, they will both turn to look at it. That's your window, Hassan. It was an incredibly complex, high-risk plan. It relied on psychology, on predicting the enemy's reaction down to the millisecond. Ready? Hassan breathed, his finger resting on the trigger. Ready? Rostova confirmed, her rangefinder aimed. Anya pulled the pin on the grenade. She didn't throw it. She held it. Now, she whispered. Rostova's laser shot out, a tiny red dot appearing on the rock. Anya tossed the grenade in a high, soft arc. It landed silently on the ground below the enemy position. Hassan's world narrowed to the view through his scope. The grenade detonated. For a split second, the world turned white. The brilliant flash of the explosion overloaded their night vision. But just as Anya had predicted, two heads, momentarily blinded, instinctively turned towards the brighter, more focused point of Rostova's laser. Two silhouettes, perfectly framed against the fading flash. Hassan's rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final. He didn't need to see the result. He knew the shot was true. A second later, the mortar fire on the base ceased. It just stopped. In the TOC, a cheer erupted. Thorn let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. On the ridge, Anya was already moving. Pack up, she ordered the stunned sniper team. The drone swarm will be on us in 30 seconds. They scrambled after her as she led them back towards the hole in the fence. The legend of the quiet clerk solidifying into undeniable fact with every silent, professional step she took. The moment the mortar fire stopped, the dynamic of the battle shifted. The drone swarm, deprived of its spotters, lost its precision. Its attacks became more sporadic, less coordinated. It was still a threat, but it was a wounded one. The base's automated defenses, no longer overwhelmed by a two-front assault, began to methodically pick the remaining drones out of the sky. The immediate crisis was over. Anya and the sniper team slipped back through the fence just as the first drones, drawn to the flash of the grenade and the rifle shot, began to converge on their former position. Minutes later, the area they had just vacated was obliterated by a concentrated series of explosions. If they had lingered for even half a minute, they would have been annihilated. Back inside the wire, Sergeant Hassan and Corporal Rostova looked at Anya, their faces etched with a respect that bordered on reverence. They had just participated in a tactical masterclass, a perfectly orchestrated action that was more art than science. They were elite soldiers, and they knew they had just met someone who operated on a completely different level. Anya simply nodded at them. "Good work," she said, her voice devoid of any triumph. She then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the base as if she had never been there. The snipers were left to give their report. Colonel Thorne listened to Sergeant Hassan's debrief in the TOC, his expression unreadable. Hassan, a man not given to exaggeration, described the events with clinical precision. Anya's silent, swift movement through the dark, her uncanny prediction of the enemy's position, her analysis of the thermal signatures, and the brilliant high-risk plan that had worked flawlessly. "I've served with special forces teams my entire career, sir," Hassan concluded, his voice resonating with conviction. "I have never seen anything like that. She wasn't just good. She was perfect." Thorne dismissed the sergeant and turned to the main console. The battle was won. The last of the drones were being shot down. The casualty reports were still coming in, and they were grim, but they would have been catastrophic without Anya's intervention. He looked at the empty file on his desk, then at the secure comms terminal. He had been warned to stop asking questions. But a commander has a right to know who is fighting under his command. He could not let this go. He typed a new message, not to Central Command, but to the personal, encrypted channel of the general who had warned him off. "General, tonight, Specialist Anya Voronova single-handedly neutralized a coordinated electronic and kinetic attack on my base, saving the lives of dozens, if not hundreds, of soldiers. I did not ask for a ghost. I did not ask for a legend. But I have one. I am not asking for her file anymore. I am demanding it. As the commander responsible for this sector, I have a right to know the identity of the asset operating under my command." Deny this request and I will file a formal inquiry that will go all the way to the Joint Chiefs. Your call, he sent the message. It was a career-threatening gamble, a direct challenge to a 4-star general. But Thorne knew with absolute certainty that he could not command this base without knowing the truth about the woman in his supply depot. An hour passed. The base was transitioning from combat to recovery. The fires were being put out, the wounded were being tended to. The silence that followed the battle was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the fallen and the adrenaline of the survivors. Then the secure terminal on Thorne's desk chimed. A file was being transferred. It was heavily encrypted, requiring Thorne's own biometric signature to open. He placed his thumb on the scanner, and the file decrypted. It was her file, the real one. He opened it. The first page was a photograph. A younger Anya, her face harder, leaner, streaked with camouflage paint. She wore a uniform with no insignia, no name tag. But the look in her eyes was the same unnerving calm, the same focused intensity. He began to read. The commendations were staggering. Medals for valor so secret he had never even heard of them. Citations from missions that were officially denied, that had never happened. She had operated in every global hotspot for the last 15 years, always in the shadows, always alone or with a small, elite team. Then he came to her unit designation. Special Operations Group 7. SOG 7. The official name was meaningless to him. But then he saw the unit's informal call sign, the name whispered in the intelligence community like a ghost story. Task Force Spectre. They were the military's deniable assets, the scalpel used for the operations that no one could ever know about. They were officially disbanded 3 years ago after a mission in India went public, a political disaster that had led to a massive cover-up. The official story was that the unit had never existed. Its members were scattered, their records erased, their flags burned. They were made into ghosts. And then he saw her call sign, the name she had carried in that shadow world. It was a single word, Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night. As Thorne was absorbing the truth, a supply convoy that had been waiting for the all-clear finally rolled through the main gate. Among the soldiers disembarking was a grizzled sergeant major, a man named Elias Vance, his face a roadmap of old wars. He was there to coordinate logistics for the entire sector. As he walked towards the command center, he passed the supply warehouse. The door was open, and a single light was on inside. He glanced in and then froze. Standing there, calmly checking a manifest on a clipboard, was a woman he hadn't seen in 3 years. A woman he thought was dead or locked away in some forgotten black site. He walked slowly into the warehouse, his heart pounding. Nyx? He whispered, the name feeling strange and dangerous on his tongue. Anya looked up from her clipboard. Her composure finally, almost imperceptibly, broke. A flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed through her eyes. Vance, she said, her voice low. I thought you'd retired. They pulled me back in, he said, his eyes scanning her, taking in the simple logistics specialist uniform. What are they having you do here? I count inventory, she replied, her mask of neutrality slipping back into place. They burned the flag, Elias. The unit is gone. The flag can burn, Vance said, his voice thick with emotion. But the soldiers remember. We remember what you did in India. You took the fall for all of us. They tried to erase you, but legends don't erase at that moment. Colonel Thorne walked into the warehouse. He had seen Vance arrive and had come to greet him, but he stopped dead when he saw him talking to Anya. He saw the look on the sergeant major's face, a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. Thorne held the datapad with her file. He looked from the file to the woman standing before him. The clerk, the ghost, the legend. It was all true. Specialist Voronova? Thorne said. His voice different now, stripped of its arrogance and filled with a new, profound respect. A word, please. Anya looked from Vance to Thorne. The two worlds she had tried to keep separate were colliding. Her past had finally caught up with her. The reveal was complete. The next morning, the entire base was ordered to a mandatory formation in the main square. It was an unusual order, especially after a major attack. The soldiers stood in neat ranks, their faces tired but curious. Whispers rippled through the formation. They were talking about the battle, about the mortars that had suddenly stopped, about the quiet clerk from the supply depot. Colonel Thorne stood before them on a raised platform. Beside him, to the shock of everyone present, stood Specialist Anya Voronova. She was in a clean uniform, her expression as impassive as ever. She stood at ease, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Sergeant Major Vance stood off to the side, his presence lending a solemn gravity to the proceedings. Thorne looked out at the faces of his soldiers. He saw Carter, Petrova, Hassan, Rostova. He saw the medics, the engineers, the infantrymen. All of them were alive because of the woman standing next to him. Last night, Thorne began, his voice amplified by a speaker system. This base weathered a complex and vicious attack. We took casualties. We will mourn our fallen. But we held the line. We held it because of the courage and skill of the soldiers at this base. But we also held it because of the actions of one individual. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have been taught that strength comes from protocol, from following orders, from the structure of the chain of command. But sometimes, true strength comes from the quiet competence of a single soldier. It comes from the person who does the job not for glory or recognition, but because it needs to be done. He turned and looked directly at Anya. Specialist Anya Voronova, he said, his voice ringing with a formal authority that was now laced with deep respect. Step forward. Anya took one precise step forward. She did not look at the colonel or the assembled soldiers. She continued to stare at the distant mountains. For actions taken during the defense of forward operating base Sentinel, Thorne continued, reading from a datapad, for demonstrating tactical and strategic brilliance under extreme duress, for a singular act of intervention that directly resulted in the cessation of hostile mortar fire and the preservation of this command. It is my honor as base commander to award you the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device. An officer stepped forward holding a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal the medal, but Thorne held up a hand, stopping him. He looked back at Anya. A medal is a piece of metal, Thorne said, his voice lowering, becoming more personal. It's a symbol, and sometimes the symbols we are given aren't the ones we've truly earned. He turned to Sergeant Major Vance. Sergeant Major, if you would. Vance stepped forward. He was not carrying a medal. He was carrying a small, folded object. It was a patch. It was simple, black, with a single stylized silver emblem in the center. The sigil of Task Force Spectre. It was a symbol that was not supposed to exist anymore. Vance walked up to Anya. He stood before her, and for the first time her impassive mask seemed to crack. Her eyes glistened, her jaw tight with emotion. He held out the patch. They burned the flag, Nix, Vance said, his voice low enough for only her and Thorne to hear. But they couldn't find all the pieces. Anya slowly raised her hand and took the patch. Her fingers closed around the worn fabric, a tangible link to a life, a family, they had tried to steal from her. It was not a resurrection of her old unit. It was an acknowledgement, a statement that you can burn a flag, but you cannot burn the honor of those who served under it. Thorne then did something that sent a shockwave through the formation. He stepped down from the platform, stood directly in front of Anya, and raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. It was not the perfunctory salute a commander gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a soldier he deeply, profoundly respects. It was a public act of deference, an apology, and a thank you, all in one gesture. For a long moment, the entire base was silent. Then, Sergeant Major Vance saluted. Sergeant Hassan and Corporal Rostova, standing in the front rank, saluted. Corporal Carter, his eyes wide with emotion, saluted. Private Petrova, tears streaming down her face, saluted. A wave of respect washed over the formation. One by one, every soldier on FOB Sentinel raised their hand, not to Specialist Voronova the logistics clerk, but to the quiet hero who had walked among them unseen. They were saluting the ghost, the legend, the woman who had saved them all. Anya stood there, holding the small patch, receiving the tribute of 1,000 soldiers. She did not salute back. Her station, her erased past, did not permit it. Instead, she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement of their respect, an acceptance of her place among them once more. The public recognition was complete. Her honor, if not her record, had been restored. The ceremony ended, and the formation was dismissed. The soldiers dispersed, but the atmosphere on the base had been permanently altered. The mystery of Specialist Voronova had been replaced by a quiet, deeply held respect. She was no longer an outsider. She was a guardian, a silent protector. Anya returned to her warehouse. She did not put the Spectre patch on her uniform. That part of her life was over. Instead, she took out a small sewing kit. With meticulous stitches, she sewed the patch onto the inside of her uniform, over her heart. It was a private banner, a flag for an army of one. It would not be seen by anyone else, but she would know it was there. Her work did not change. She still counted crates, still managed manifests. But now, when she walked through the base, soldiers would nod to her, their eyes conveying a message of gratitude and respect that words could not. Colonel Thorne no longer watched her with suspicion. He now sought her counsel. He would appear at the warehouse not with accusations, but with maps and intelligence reports. "Voronova," he would say, "I'd like your opinion on our patrol routes," and she would give it, her advice always quiet, concise, and brutally effective. She had not been promoted. Her file was not officially changed. On paper, she was still just a logistics specialist. But she now held a position of authority on the base that transcended rank. She was the quiet center of the storm, the calm voice of experience that everyone, from the lowest private to the base commander, now turned to. Weeks later, as the sun set over the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Anya stood alone on the warehouse loading dock, looking out at the base. It was calm, secure. The new defensive measures she had suggested were in place. The soldiers moved with a new confidence, a new purpose. She had not raised a flag on a pole for all to see. She had not reclaimed her old rank or her old name. But she had raised something far more important. She had raised the standard of what it meant to be a soldier. She had shown them that honor is not something that is given by a government or recorded in a file. It is something you carry inside you, something that is demonstrated through action, not proclaimed with words. Corporal Carter walked by, leading a new group of replacements. He saw her and stopped. "Ma'am," he said, and then gestured to the new soldiers. "This is Specialist Voronova. If you get into trouble, you listen to what she says." The new soldiers looked at the unassuming woman with curiosity. They saw a supply clerk, but Carter and everyone else at FOB Sentinel saw the truth. They saw the living embodiment of the Special Forces banner, a symbol of quiet professionalism, of unyielding competence, and of the unquenchable spirit of a true warrior. Anya watched them walk away, then turned her gaze back to the mountains. A cold wind blew down from the peaks, but she didn't feel it. In the quiet dignity of her earned respect, she was finally at peace. The flag they had burned was just cloth. Her real banner was the safety of the soldiers around her, and it was a flag that would never be lowered.